Hello, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here with you. It's a good way to start the week. We're doing a lot of things right now at once. Okay, this is our Mishna Monday class. Every Monday at noon, that there are no calendrical conflicts. Every Monday at noon, we're here. We're studying the code of Jewish law, the great code of Jewish law, the Mishna, recorded in 220 of the Common Era. This particular season that we are in, the time between Passover and Shavuot, the time between the Exodus and the Revelation, we prepare for that journey by studying a particular volume of the Mishnah, Avot, the ancestors. And this is the wisdom of the ancestors, and it is a special tractate because it's devoted not to law, as all of the other tractates are, all other 62 tractates, but to ethics, or that's how we might think of it, the wisdom of living, ethics. And that's already a lot to say, that we prepare for revelation by checking our ethical being, our ethical conduct, our conduct in the world. Ethics, there are many definitions, but we might say the ought, not the must, but the ought of good living, good conduct in the world, right? That which is not required but is good to do. So that we're doing as well. And then the last thing that we're doing in this little series for the next, this is the second of 5 weeks that we'll do this, is we have the opportunity, we don't usually, to look at the Mishnah through the lens of the Hasidic commentators, because they mostly commented on narrative sections of the Bible. All right, that's a whole tradition. It's kind of midrashic tradition, but because Avot, this tractate, is so beloved and so kind of universally applicable and admired, they commented. There's a lot of mystical Hasidic commentary on that, and so we're calling this the ethics of the mystics, the Hasidic movement being a mystical spiritual revival that was birthed in the 1700s. And we have this opportunity to look now at some of the, we think of that as like a kind of a spiritualist movement seeking God, but we have an opportunity to look at their ethical thinking. Last week, we looked at one of the great teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. And today, we're going to be looking at the founder of Chabad Hasidut, the Baal HaTanya. And I must say, as we head in, that those two names, those two figures, Rabbi Nachman and the Baal HaTanya, who I'll say a little bit more about when we get to it, these are truly two of the greatest geniuses they are two of the great geniuses of Hasidut. They are also two of the greatest minds that the Jewish tradition has known. So, and maybe one last caveat, which is to say that I am definitely underqualified to teach them. I mean, we're talking about like quantum high level string theory physics of Judaism here. These thinkers, but we're going to look at their most basic teachings as we did last week, and see what kind of behavior are they imagining fits with the Hasidic, the mystically oriented life. Okay, all right. Let's say a blessing to bring us into the learning today. A blessing ends la'asok b'divrei Torah, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, and we're also, I should say, counting the Omer, and last night we counted the 22nd day of the Omer. So, yeah, that's where we're at 22 days into this 50-day journey is the way to think of it. Okay, so let's get right into it. So what we're going to do, as we did last time, is to take a look at a Mishnah, a teaching from the Mishnah, the rabbinic code from 220, and we'll think about it for a second, and then we'll see how this Mishnah is an entry point, is picked up to deliver one of the foundational teachings of Hasidic thought. So let's start first with the Mishnah, and I will put a source sheet into the chat, but I'll do mostly screen sharing. Okay, so here we go. We're going to take a look now. The Mishnah that we're going to look at is okay. is delivered as a kind of a bundle of teachings. This is often the way it works. We're in the second chapter because this is the second time we're going to do 5 chapters. So we're in the second chapter, and the teachings are given over in bundles. So this is Rabbi Shimon's set of teachings, the teachings that Rabbi Shimon was known for, his wisdom. And so we're only going to be focused on the last of those teachings today, the bolded part, but I think it's always important to see it in context. What packet of teachings did he deliver? So we'll have this just as a reference point so that we have the context. But these are Rabbi Shimon's most famous teachings, ethical teachings, like personal development teachings. And it's the last one that we're going to think a lot about today. So Rabbi Shimon said, be careful. Who is Rabbi Shimon? I guess I should just say he's the son of Rabban Gamliel, who was the leader of the Jewish people at the time of the destruction, the sort of the kind of beginning of rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Shimon said, be careful with the recitation of Shema. Be careful, be careful and fastidious about saying the Shema every day, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and with daily prayer, the Amidah as well. So just be careful. And we could spend our whole hour talking about what careful means there, but okay, be careful with it. And as if to extend that thought, he says, and when you do pray, K'shata mitpalel, al tas tfilatcha keva. Don't make your prayer something rote and automatic, keva, like something just like you click in and you do the same thing every day. Don't make prayer like that, but make it a plea for compassion before God. Make it a real, sincere calling out for God's compassion. For it is said, for God is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, and renouncing punishment. Okay? So that's the proof text. Again, this is not law. This is Rabbi Shimon reading the book of Yoel, the book of Joel, and saying, look, we are taught this. What I would like you to keep in mind, that prayer should be sincere and heartfelt and not something that you just sort of move through without thinking about. Okay, so these are his teachings. And then he adds one more teaching. I don't know how connected it is, but this is the part we're going to look at today. Va'al tihi rasha bifnei atzmecha. And do not regard yourself as a wicked person. Do not think of yourself as a wicked person. And I'll just translate it literally, just so that we have like this right here, va'al, and do not be a wicked person. Bifnei atzmecha is before yourself. Okay? So we could translate it lots of different ways. Do not consider yourself a wicked person. Do not be a wicked person in your own eyes. Do not regard yourself as a wicked person. Okay. That is the teaching that we're going to get into today. And it may remind you, you may already feel like, oh, this feels familiar. Last week's class, we spent a lot of time talking about Rabbi Nachman's great teaching was look for the good in yourself. Always look for the good in yourself. Search for it. Strive for it. Oh, be devoted singularly to finding the good in yourself and in everyone else. Okay, it's interesting. He didn't use this Mishnah, but the Mishnah sounds like it's in a similar realm. How do you regard yourself? And in this case, the teaching that the Baal HaTanya is going to take in a very different direction is do not be a wicked person bifnei atzmecha, before yourself. Okay, Payam's already got a kind of interpretation of like why is this important? What does it mean? So Payam.
Why am I seeking compassion if I'm not a wicked person? I mean, this almost sounds like a Roman Greek god that's capricious and arbitrary, right? Like the Greeks and the Romans were like, they're just normal people, and these gods were bored and they were just shooting lightning bolts at them, even though they weren't wicked, right? I mean, there's really a problematic issue here for me, at least.
Very, very sharply and beautifully put, Payam. I gave you the context. You could take it or leave it. Payam takes it and says, wait a minute. This teacher, Rabbi Shimon, just told me that you really have to beg for God's mercy. But why? What does it mean to beg for God's mercy when you shouldn't think of yourself as a wicked person? What do you need mercy for? Right? You're fine. So there is a tension maybe in those two ideas, and it's important that Payam alerts us to that, because the truth is the rest of our teaching is going to be, as much Hasidic teaching is, about a kind of a tension between contradictory ideas. Okay. One of the ideas is, don't think of yourself as a bad person, a wicked person. So Payam already senses that, yeah, don't think of yourself as a wicked person is a kind of corrective to, but do call out to God for mercy. Yeah. Okay. Don't call out to God and beg God for mercy, but don't beat yourself up. Don't go too far. Okay. I'm going to take comments from Kate and Yonatan, and then we'll head into the Balatanya. Kate, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too. To me, it's just struck me that when you approach prayer, you're not asking for penance for yourself. You know, if I'm a wicked person, then I'm approaching prayer, you know, as, oh, I need to seek penance. So instead, I'm asking for, perhaps in a greater sense, you know, for more than just myself.
Beautiful. So Kate attempts to resolve the contradiction, and I think beautifully, and says, no, that's the idea. You can ask for God's mercy. You say, God, bestow mercy upon me and on all creation, but not because we're wicked, just because we need it. Like, and there's some way in which, like, don't let that need for support and help turn into a kind of, right? Yeah, beautiful. Yonatan, did you also have a comment? Or did you?
Yeah, this reminds me of a teaching that you taught us right before COVID hit, which was that the Talmud actually begins, one of the very first things that happens is we find out that Rabbi Shimon and his siblings come home drunk and they haven't said the Shema yet, and their father, Rabbi Gamliel, tells them to say it, right? And that just pulls together all the different components of, like, well, you don't have to pray regularly, you don't have to see yourself as a failure, but you do have to do your best, right? Don't just go around beating yourself up. Try to do something productive.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I'm so happy right now. What Yonatan just did. Oh my goodness. That's the first story ever told in the Mishna, that this rabbi had these sons that went out drinking all night, and they came home and they'd forgotten to say the Shema. They hadn't been careful about it. And what do you do then? Then he says, say it anyway, right? As if to say, well, you still have time. Do you know who that rabbi was? That was Rabbi Gamliel. One of the sons who had been out drinking was Rabbi Shimon, our teacher in this Mishnah. So that's like wild connection. I mean, that's like really brilliant, really brilliant. I'm going to double check this. I hope I don't have the wrong Rabbi Shimon here. Sometimes these are like 2 generations apart. We should double check this. But if so, Yonatan, you just made a beautiful, beautiful connection in the Mishnah here. Okay. And again, attempt to sort of resolve contradictory factors. It don't be a wicked person. In other words, ends up being a kind of, look, we're all striving here, but don't, like, have some compassion on yourself. Ask for God's compassion, but you be compassionate to yourself too. I love that. That sounds good. That's great teaching, right? Let's just stop there. But we're going to now head into, we're going to sort of springboard into the Baal Hatanya. Let's just do a little background here. The Baal Hatanya is what we often refer to this thinker as the Baal Hatanya, the master of the Tanya, the one who wrote the Tanya. This is the book, Tanya. And that his name is Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And he's the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? All of those names. All of those sort of titles, he's known by the founder of Chabad philosophy. I mean, we're talking about a really towering figure here. He lived from 1745 to 1812, born in what we would call Poland, Lithuania-ish area, I don't know which one, and taught and preached in what we would call Russia. What is Russia? Actually, was Russia then too, Lubavitch. And then at a total genius, like a Mozart level genius, you know, at 8 years old, he had written a commentary on the Torah, right? That incorporated all kinds of other commentaries. Like his work is astounding and very, 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 very difficult to understand. But he was also significantly part of the original circle that gathered around the Maggid of Mezrich, the Chavraya Kadisha, that it was called, the Holy Circle. And so he's one of the absolute founding thinkers of Hasidut. And what the work that we're studying, the Tanya, is the sort of philosophical masterpiece of Hasidut, of Hasidic thought. The exposition of like, what is Hasidut? What is this brand of mysticism? It is a theological work, and you'll find it in a discussion of the very nature of God and creation and all these things, but it actually begins with an ethical question. In fact, the word Tanya, it's called the Tanya, which sounds like the name Tanya. The word Tanya means it was taught, and that's just the first word in the book. It was taught. And so books often take their name from their first work. It was taught, and then he poses an ethical question. But what's really interesting is that if you open, wasn't meant to be called the Tanya, it was taught. If you open the book into the like cover page here, it says collected teachings, which is called by the name. It gives a name, but we never call it by this, but it's going to be important for our focus today. Sefer Shel Benonim, the book of the average, or the book of the middle people, the book of the intermediaries, the book of the average people, okay? Sefer Shel Benonim. That word is, we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about that word today, Benonim, okay? People in the middle, people, average people, okay? So anyway, so that's the Tanya. Now let's take a look at how the Tanya starts. This is the opening gambit here in the Tanya. And I've tried really hard to simplify. I took out some paragraphs that wild tangents into other places. I mean, it's very dense, and we're talking about there are books of his I cannot read. I can't get through. Like I don't understand enough. The Tanya, at least this opening section, is a discussion of some basic ethical questions. And even still, it gets tangled, but let's see where he goes with it, okay? So here is the beginning of the Sefer. Look at this. This is not something I choose. Sefaria just gives me this title, like it's the title when you select this text. The Tanya Part 1, the Book of Average Men, Benonim, okay? So what does that mean, the Book of Average People, right? Okay, so we're about to see. Okay, so Payam pointed us to certain contradictions, and the Balatanya is going to also start with a kind of contradiction, okay? And he does so by citing another text. So we're going to start now with another text, a quote from the Talmud. And the quote from the Talmud is, it is taught. This is the first word of the Tanya. Tanya, it is taught. An oath is issued to the soul. I'm going to move this over here because it keeps obscuring the text. An oath is issued to the soul before birth. They make you take an oath before you're born. Whatever you are, your future being, your soul, your little pre-embryonic self. They make everyone take an oath, and the oath is, or the pledge, or I don't know what the right word is. They make you commit to this. Be righteous, or be a righteous person. Tehi tzadik, and be not wicked. Va'al tehi rasha. Okay, that's the teaching. That's good enough, clear enough. But even if everyone in the world tells you you are righteous, view yourself as wicked, right? Even if everyone says you're a tzaddik, you are. These are the three words we're going to pay attention to during this discussion. Tzaddik, a righteous person, like tzedek, righteousness. Rasha, a wicked person. And then Benonim, we'll eventually get to that, an average person. Okay, so be righteous and be not wicked. That seems straightforward. But even if everyone in the world tells you you are righteous, view yourself as wicked. Okay, now, I think you can already, we've spent some time studying a text, or you can already see what there's a contradiction coming, right? Like these texts are about to collide. Okay, but let's just make sure we understand, because this text in some ways is the more confusing text. Be righteous, don't be wicked. But even if everyone's telling you, you are such a tzaddik, oh my gosh, you're such a tzaddik. By the way, just know that when you become a rabbi, people start telling you that. You know what I mean? I didn't become a better person when I became a rabbi. Suddenly everybody's like, oh, you're such a good person, you're a rabbi. Nothing changed. It's like there's certain like modes you can occupy where the world is telling you you're good, you're good, you're good. But even if they are, it's now the language here is very strong. In your own eyes, you should be a wicked person. Whoa. Okay, does anyone want to make sense of that? Why should you do that? It was easier, I think, for us to say why we would not think of ourselves as a wicked person. But why is this text telling us to think of ourselves as a wicked person? Anyone have a handle on that? Marianka.
To avoid, I think it's called hubris, to avoid pride, because that makes you wicked, I think,
Great, beautiful, right to the point. I think that's like the thrust of this. If at the most basic read would be retain some humility, okay? And the way you do that is to, but it's a strange formulation, is to see yourself. I'm not a good person. I'm not a good person. In fact, I'm a bad person. Do I have to? Is that how I maintain humility? I mean, it's still troubling, but I think Marianka's right that there's a kind of strive to be good, strive to be good, strive to be good, but don't think you're good. And I don't know whether this is good advice, but I will say I wonder if you like me feel like we don't like it when people think they're good people. I'm such a good person. Oh my God, I do so much good for the world. Oh, do you know I'm a rabbi at Ikar? Do you know how good the work we do? And I'm at the head of that. I mean, there's Rabbi Browse, but whatever. I mean, I'm a great person. I mean, you just don't want there's something wrong with that. Right. So Marianka has one pass at it, but maybe let's continue to I see Matt's got a thought here, and then we're going to look at the tension between the texts. Matt.
Yeah, there are two things that come to my mind here. One is the thing about, in one hand, what is it that I think that I am the world was created for me, and I am made from dust and ashes, and I go back and forth. But psychologically, emotionally, I remember a rabbi explaining to me why we bench after the meal, because it's easy to do all that when we're hungry and we're asking for stuff. That's easy to say, oh God, you're so wonderful. Now give me some food. But now, okay, I'm in that middle place. I'm not in need. And now I can show my true self, my true thankfulness. Again, that's a psychological thing I'm putting in, an emotional thing, not so much a textual.
Yeah. So again, there's a kind of constant balancing that perhaps in both of these texts, we're seeing some like tension where you have to figure out how to stay humble, stay hungry, stay yearning, stay in a place of need, and remember that even as, and maybe part of that is to see yourself as lacking. But the language is very strong here. See, even if the whole world sees you as a good person, see yourself as a wicked person. Now, okay, I'm just going to put it into dialogue with the other text because the Balatanya does this very quickly. This is when I say the opening gambit, the problem is not this text. The problem is, how does this text intersect with another text? And it turns out to be the text that we just studied. Okay, so let's just take a look, and then I'm going to turn back to the hands that I saw up. So take a look. But this is difficult to understand. What do you mean? View yourself as wicked. That doesn't, you can't say that, at least not if I'm trying to reconcile the teachings I know from the tradition. Have we not also learned in Avot 2:13, do not regard yourself as a wicked person? So direct contradiction. View yourself as wicked, do not regard yourself as a wicked person. How do you resolve this tension? He's going to say, there's a problem here. Which of these people is giving me the right advice? Which of these voices in the Talmud? And here's where it gets, folks, this is where it starts to, it's not just textual, right? Like there's a real, remember that we're doing ethical work here, and we're doing it under the guidance of someone who's like kind of known for a kind of spiritual obsession with the work of the inner work, the work of the soul. So I think you begin to see that here when he doesn't just provide a textual problem, but also says, let's think about this on a soul level. So look at the next piece here. He says, there's a textual problem, but also there's a kind of a psychic problem, which is that what's more, if one is wicked in one's own eyes, one will feel pain in one's heart and become depressed and will be unable to serve God with a joyful and glad heart. It's not, how could you be told to think of yourself as a wicked person? That will leave you feeling bad and shameful and down and worthless. And then you'll be worthless because you won't be able to do anything. That's not what we want in this religion, do we? But he says, on the other hand, if one is not pained in one's heart by this, in other words, if you don't have that, here's the other way of thinking about it, then this could lead to irreverence, God forbid. On the other hand, you could get, and now the word here in the Hebrew is kalut, which isn't really irreverence. It's like lightness or frivolity. Here, let's stick this in, right? Lightness, frivolity, like just to give us some other words here. There's a textual problem. We saw that up here. And then there is the danger of, on the one hand, becoming depressed by thinking you are wicked, but on the other hand, becoming like, I almost would say like kind of who cares person, like light, like whatever, nothing means anything anyway. It's all BS. Like that's a danger too, okay? So this is the danger that that exists on either end, and you can see different teachers in the tradition seeming to do think of yourself as a bad person. No, don't think of yourself as a bad. Wait, so what do we do? This is the opening problem. What do we do? Should we think of ourselves as a bad person, and is that a kind of a good way of, I should be better, I should push myself harder? Or should we think of ourselves, never think of ourselves as a bad person, because we need to tend to like the loving ourselves? Okay, so I'm now the floor is wide open, and I'd love to hear thoughts on where we land in that tension. How would you resolve it? And then we're going to hear how the Balatanya resolves it. I saw Florine and then Jen.
If you think of the soul as beautiful, and that's your essential you, then your soul signature might have gone astray. So you always know within Judaism how to correct, return, go back, and fix your soul signature. So I think all those terms are really bad. I mean, to say you're bad, you're good, you're this or that. Something, you've taken what's beautiful, you've squandered it somehow. Now you can adjust it. You have a way.
Okay, I love that language. That brings us right into the high holidays, doesn't it?
It's David Cooper's God is being. It's his way of thinking, Rabbi David.
Well, and it's and what you're giving us is an ancient way of thinking, I think, which is to put it in the language of tshuva, of return, right? Returning to, your soul has a kind of pure state. Florian said a beautiful, at least, state, and you've deviated from it. So your true self cannot be, one way of thinking about this is you are behaving like a bad person, but your truest self is not a bad person. And so Florian's like, I'm not even preaching all the like, you're a bad person, you're a good person. Like, this is a more kind of like a more nuanced and dynamic tension that's in process. Okay, Jen.
It's funny because I think what I have to say is similar in terms of practice, but not in terms of sort of the fundamental understanding of personhood that's behind it. I really try to never identify myself with any generalization like that as an essential part of my nature. And in fact, those generalizations, ultimately, if you really try to pin them down, don't have a lot of meaning. And I do that in terms of like Sometimes in some circumstances I respond intelligently, sometimes I really don't. Sometimes I respond with what I might say is virtue, and sometimes I really don't. So my essential nature is fluid. It's a process of responding to circumstance and context. It's not any one fixed quality or state of being.
Okay, great. I think that I really, really appreciate that framework. And I think it's an important one to, we've been hearing it emerge, and Jen gives it very crisp language. There's a kind of wariness here that we might, that Jen counsels us to have of any essential kind of binary way of thinking about the way you are, human beings are, it is. And that actually there's got to be, there's like a more fluid, a more like, who knows what the essential nature of the self is. And in fact, don't we all experience ourselves as changing and above all on this axis? Don't I feel like bad sometimes? Don't I feel virtuous sometimes? Isn't that so? I can, okay. Now I think that's really helpful, and it may be, and I think it's somewhat a product of our kind of post-structuralist place in history, that it may be we ultimately kind of will have less patience for the categories of good, not just good and evil, but good person and evil person. But we're going to keep using them and seeing how they're used in the tradition. But I will say that even as we move forward with a little suspicion, let us also remember that the Balatanya here is problematizing all this. So we are in a place where this dilemma is, like, he too is saying, it doesn't seem like it can work exactly one way or the other. But in the meantime, I'll ask your patience, Jen and other post-structuralists. In the meantime, he is going to give us a very, or at least return in the tongue to some very kind of good people, bad people categories, and just think of it as a thought experiment, okay, for now. So let's take a look at how he begins to resolve this tension, and he's going to resolve it with this language of tzaddik and rasha, good person, bad person, but also with this middle category of Benoni. Okay, I see that Alexandra and Allison have hands up. Anything that you feel like it is of the moment that we need before we dive in? Yeah, Allison.
I have. So I just wanted to share that, like, the middle person, it reminds me of like the middle pillar, like somewhere between good and evil is like where we are when we're like, you know. And specifically on this topic, we've been talking about the context in which you might want to think of yourself as an evil person is in that moment when everybody is saying to you, oh, you're such a tzaddik, you know, like you're such a good person. And so what it actually brought to mind for me was like Karl Bach. Because I think sometimes a person can find themselves in a situation in a community when everybody is saying to them, like, you're the greatest. And that can really go to a person's head. And especially certain people, like maybe rabbis, maybe like a great rabbi, can become so elevated by the community that maybe he needs to tell himself, I'm a bad person, because that like self-reminder can maybe be a corrective, you know, to acknowledge for oneself that, like, even though I have this elevated position in community, I still have Yetzer Hara inside of myself. I can't trust myself just to be all good. I have to be aware of the fact that I also have an evil impulse.
Great. Okay, I really appreciate those sort of like comments as an introductory, a last introductory breath before we head in, because as I said, we're about to head into these categories, but I think Allison, the language that Allison uses is so helpful and so important, because Allison reminds us that a lot of the conversation that even the Mishna is having, but certainly, you know, that the Balatanya is going to take us into, it's not just about what you are. right? Actually, the most of the language is how do you regard yourself? What is your relationship to yourself? And that's a different kind of question. It's like what is it I see when I look in the mirror, in the spiritual mirror? And that's part of what we're asking here. And that has some kind of consequence in the world, but it doesn't take place in the world, right? At least it's somewhat separate. It's about self-perception. It's about perception. Okay. All right. So let's push forward a little bit now and look into these categories of good and bad, and then this kind of strange category of the middle. Okay. So he says this is how you think of it. The matter is as follows. Okay. We find in the Talmud, in one kind of classic passage in the Talmud, 5 different types of people. Okay. There is a list of the Talmud gives us 5 different categories of people. Tzaddik v'tovlo, a righteous person who has good. Tzaddik v'ralo, a righteous person who has evil. Rasha v'tovlo, a wicked person who has good. Rasha v'ralo, a wicked person who has evil. And an average person, v'benoni. Or Benoni now, well, we have to spend some time thinking about this. This word Benoni, Bain is like between or in the middle. So I don't know if average is the right translation, but the person right in the middle, right between the Tzaddik and the Rasha. Now, I have to take a little bit of a pause here and make sure that we don't misunderstand, because these phrases, Tzaddik v'ralo, are often understood to mean something very different, which is, and not just often. In the Talmud, one interpretation of these terms is tzaddik v'tovlo is a righteous person and good things happen to them. Tzaddik v'ralo is, what about a righteous person and bad things happen to them? How do we make sense of that? Okay. So that's one interpretation, but the Baal HaTanya is going to follow a different interpretation. And the reason that he's following a different interpretation of these terms is because he wants to figure out this middle category. What does it mean, the middle category, the middle person? Because that doesn't fit into the other paradigm of, and bad things happen to them and good things happen to them. So if you hear that echo of a good, righteous person and still bad things happen to them, we're not going to be using that interpretation. Instead, we're using the following, and he's going to quote the Talmud and pick an interpretation. What are these things? What is a tzaddik, a v'tovlo? And the sages explained in the Talmud that the righteous person who has good is a completely righteous person, whereas the righteous person who has evil is a person who is righteous but not completely. Okay? Okay, let's just be clear here. This is sort of like the work part. Let's make sure we understand his categories, because eventually he's heading for the significance of the middle person. But he's saying there are categories. There's a perfect tzaddik, perfectly righteous person. There's a righteous person, but not perfectly righteous. There's a perfectly wicked person, a rasha, total evil. There's an evil person, but not totally. And then there's the person in the middle. So now let's just pause for a second. Can anyone help me understand who the heck the person in the middle is in this scheme? What does that mean? Someone who's in the middle of the, of the tiers of, okay, so let me turn to Alexandra, still has her hand up.
I think it's important to keep in mind the title of this book, the book for the average person, when looking at the words and these definitions and descriptions, because the average spiritual thinker or the average person is probably not a spiritual thinker, needs like categories like this, and maybe not today so much, but certainly back then. So the idea of thinking in black and white, good, bad, is essential for the average person if you're writing a book that's sort of a model of personal transformation and spiritual elevation for the black and white thinker who thinks in these categories. So I think it's important to contextualize the words in that sense, and also important to look at how they do or don't apply to the way we think today. But it makes a lot of sense to me, and it's a pretty practical paradigm that, okay, so I'm an average person and I want to get to the next tier. And I want to work on myself and get to this next tier through this spiritual work of prayer and the Shema specifically that we mentioned, that you talked about at the beginning. And specifically taking care of and saying the Shema with care, the part about God is everything and love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your very being. And if everything, and so, yes, I'm good and I'm bad and I want to be better. And if I look and if I say the Shema with care, which is everything is God, God is love, love is everything, then that is a model for how I can transcend that, but also bypassing my need for these, if I'm an average person, for these categories. So I'm going to intellectually understand it this way, but prayer and the Shema is the path for the personal transformation.
Okay. Beautiful. You really kind of tied together a lot there, but I think the especially crucial is what you reminded us, which is that this is a book for the Benoni. This is written, the whole thing is called the book for the average person. That's, in other words, the suggestion is we're all average people. Come on. We're not, the very book title suggests, like, if you're reading this, like, this is a book for us, for the middle people, you know? And Alexandra says, and I think very helpfully and wisely, that, okay, so then you can imagine an average person needing to think in these categories. It's helpful to think in category. What does it mean to be a better person? What does it mean to be how do I work on that? All those things. But I'm an average person. I'm not either one. And we'll start from that place. And in fact, this is such a powerful, it's such powerful language. And it really, you hear it in Chabad circles. Like, oh, just to, like, if someone uses the word tzaddik, righteous person, I just want to be a Benoni. Like, just to be that's an incredible thing, just to be an average, like, just so you know, this is this language of, like, that's what we're striving actually to be average. We're just trying to be average people grappling with these things. But I get ahead of myself. I'm ahead of myself. I want to push us a little bit further forward into this text so that we really understand what he's doing here. Okay. And then hopefully have some time to open it back up and really kind of, hash it out at the end. But okay, so we have the idea that there's a completely righteous person or a completely evil person, right? So then in that scheme, what would a middle person be? I don't know, half-half? But then he says, but there are other ways of thinking about this. Later in the Talmud, I hear a different description, which is that the righteous are ruled by their good inclination. The righteous are people who are generally guided by goodness. It's not that they don't have any bad in them, but they're ruled by goodness. The wicked are ruled by their evil inclination. The wicked tend towards while the average person, here's now like another pass at what does it mean to be an average person? An average person is, and that judged is not the right word. I changed this. Ruled by both inclinations. Okay, so you have both things moving inside. Okay, that's just another formulation, and I now feel like, oh, maybe this too I should have edited out because it just makes things even more complicated. But here he is giving us another pass at what it is to be average. Okay, but here's his real problem, is in this passage in the Talmud, where it starts speaking about the righteous, the wicked, and the middle. Rabbi, one of the later sages of the Talmud, says, I, for example, said Rabbi, am a Benoni. I, one of the sages of the Talmud, said, I'm a Benoni, I'm an average person. So we just talked about like this Hasidic book saying we're all average, but a sage of the Talmud said I'm an average person. Now, this is gonna be a problem, okay? This is a problem. Now, first of all, it's a problem even in the moment because his student Rabbi's student or study partner said to him, Babaya said to him, our master makes it impossible for any other creature to live. What does he mean by that? What he means by that is like, what do you mean? If you're the teacher of the generation, if you're an average person, like, where does that leave me? You know what I mean? Like, you know, like Rabbi Brous gets up on Yom Kippur and says, I'm such a crappy human being. And you're like, you are? You know, so that's what Abai is saying. And the Balatanya is also concerned with that. And look at the language the Balatanya uses. So he says, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. We need to understand what is the true nature of the Benoni, because it can't be someone who's half-half. Because if that were the case, how could a Rabbi mistake himself for a Benoni? We're talking about one of the greatest people our tradition has ever recorded. You're saying they're just sort of like 50-50? And here's a legend about Rabbi. It is known that his lips never ceased reciting words of Torah, such that even the angel of death could not overwhelm him. That's a known fact, by the way, everybody. But okay. So how would he make such a mistake to consider himself half sinful? It's impossible. You can't, like, this category doesn't make sense. Okay. Now, he's going to try and resolve this dilemma. But I want to just give us some time a little bit to process it before he heads to his resolution. Again, he's sort of turning around. He's like, well, we have various ways of thinking about a good person, bad person. Sometimes there's a little less good person, a little less bad, but there's this other category of the middle person. And one of the greatest sages of the generation said, yep, I'm a middle person. And you already know that the Balatanya is going to be saying to us, yeah, we're middle people, but what is it? Okay, so I'd love to hear anyone kind of come in and weigh in on this. Sophia, please.
Wait, isn't it arrogant of him to say even that he's a middle person instead of a wicked person?
Yeah, great point. I mean, like, wasn't the advice, the negotiation of like thinking of yourself wasn't the advice to say, think of yourself as a wicked person? So now he's like, oh, I'm not bad. No way, I'm average. Right? Right. Okay. So great question. Is that all, Sophia? Yeah. Okay. Let's return then to Payam.
Instead of average, think of it as neutral. It's like potential energy in science or physics. So that what he's saying is it is in a neutral point of view, that he can either go up or down, that there's inclinations and incentives, etc., on the human soul to move it up and down on the spectrum. And so Benoni is a person who's neutral, who can have either forces of evil on him or the forces of good on him. And then that spectrum is which force do you let work on?
Okay. I like Payam's theory. It's a little bit like tabula rasa. Like, you show up to the world, you could go either way. You go either way. And after all, what we just read there, a middle person is guided by both their good and evil impulses. Isn't that really the Jewish theory of personhood? We have bad impulses, good impulses. We're guided, we're kind of pulled in both directions. We're fluid, right? We're fluid. Like, we have these, we oscillate along a tension. That's fair. That's fair. Okay, I want to give anyone who hasn't spoken yet, want to give a chance to weigh in on any of this? Take a beat here. No? Okay, return to some folks we've heard from. Alexandra.
I think it's important to keep in mind something I feel very strongly about is the distinction between the tzaddik and the sage. So it's possible to be a very smart, very clever interpreter of the law and not be a tzaddik. And I think that many of the sages were not tzaddikim because they were also subject to the low-level thinking of their time. And a lot of their interpretations were within the whatever low-level thinking was the zeitgeist of the time, as opposed to a tzaddik who elevates themselves above that and sees humanity in a much purer way than the way that society does. And so I think it is important when looking at the sages to consider at least the possibility that they were sages, but not necessarily tzaddikim.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's right. There's a little bit of there's a sort of extreme, what do you call it? Higgiography, a sort of glorification of, oh, it was Rabbi. He couldn't have ever done anything wrong. He only ever studied Torah. It's like, wait a minute. Actually, the truth is, if Rabbi Brous got up on Yom Kippur and said, I'm a horrible person, I would probably feel like, wow, that's so brave. I feel like a horrible person too. And thanks for sharing that, because we know nobody's perfect. Thank you for being our leader and acknowledging that. And Alexander saying, and many of the sages in the Talmud, they're just regular people. Like there are people and they're striving to be good, but I mean, yeah, right, of course. What is so shocking about this? Now, part of what's shocking about it for the Baal HaTanya, or at least the device he's using to problematize it, is to say, it seems like Rabbi's saying I have as much bad in me as I have good in me. But it's just impossible. I mean, if you knew Rabbi, you knew like a saint that walked this earth. And you know, I'm sure he had bad in him. And he struggled with it. Yeah, but I mean, like, I don't know, like pretty good. You know, like pretty, you know, like Gandhi like had some issues. But I mean, you can't be like, oh, you were an average dude, Gandhi. Right? You just can't like, so there's like so there's that's a little bit of the problematizing there. It's like, what does it really mean to say, to identify with this average category? Okay, I'm gonna take one more comment, and then we're gonna see the Baal HaTanya resolve it from Matt.
Yeah, rather than neutral, which implies to me balanced, I wonder if we could allow the word complex. That it is not that I am equally between doing good and bad, but that when I do things, there is good and bad involved in what I am doing. I am not good, and maybe there's a little bad. I'm not bad, and maybe there's a little good. I'm pretty good, but there's always a little bit of greediness or a little bit of, you know, I'm just tired and don't want to do it. It's always you know, that they are always both in play, maybe 90-10, but still both there.
Great. In other words, part of what this Benoni category is, remember that you're both. Like, remember that you're both good and bad. And that you're, right, there are these categories and they're helpful ways of thinking through these problems, but remember that you actually are made up of both these impulses that pull you. And that's what Rabbi was saying. For example, right, look at the way it looks in the actual text. It follows right on the heels of the average person or the middle person is ruled by both inclinations. For example, said Rabbi Benoni, he's just saying the obvious thing, which is like, boy, I have bad impulses for sure, and good ones. Okay. All right. So I can see how we could like try to, like, maybe this is just a thought construct. It's a way of thinking through ideas. Or is there really a category of middle person? Okay. Here's the Baal HaTanya's answer, and he's going to try and resolve this. And what he offers us is a model in resolving it for two ways of looking at ourselves. Okay, two ways of looking at ourselves. So here is his resolution, and I'll be curious to hear what you think of it. So what he says is, okay, so when we say, you can see I've skipped like paragraph 6 and I've skipped to paragraph 10. So there's like more and more that he goes on. But here's the basic answer. So when we say in a general way that someone with half good deeds and half sins is called a Benoni, and someone with a majority of good deeds is called a tzaddik. All right, so when we use terms like this, a righteous person and then a middle person, half-half. This is really remarkable language. These are terms we borrow to help us think about reward and punishment. Hu shem hamush'al le'inyan schar va'onesh. These are terms that are borrowed to help think about reward and punishment. For a person is judged based on the majority. And so it's called a tzaddik, a righteous person according to the law. Here we're back in like Yom Kippur language. Like if I'm evaluating my life, well, I hope I have more good deeds than bad deeds. Right? That's how my life is. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm putting too much on it. I'm already giving it my modern spin. But you're judged by, are you 51%, 49%, 99%? That when we use these terms, we're borrowing these terms to help think about this. But the real truth of these terms, he says, okay, so one way is to help us think about it, but the real truth about inyan amitat shem hatoar, the real truth of these terms and the real difference between a tzaddik and a benoni can be explained by what the sages said. The righteous are ruled by their good inclination, for they have no evil desire at all, having completely extinguished it. And he gives some examples of, figures like King David or some, So one who has not reached this level, even if they have more merits than sins, cannot be considered to have reached the level of a tzaddik. Okay? The real truth of these terms is that to be a tzaddik, you have to be completely good, and no one is on that level. I mean, he gives some mythical heroes who are, but the truth, why is the book written for average people? Because the bottom line is no one's righteous. No one's, not really. Like, you really are just guided by the good all the time. The real truth is that and no one's wicked, right? Impossible. No one's purely wicked. We are all Benoni. We're all in the middle, struggling to, okay? So this is not far from what Alexandra posed. It's now, but I wonder what you think of it, and we just have a few minutes, or maybe 1 minute here. But I wonder what you think of this model that says the idea, the language that we've been sort of, Florine, for example, uncomfortable with this whole time, the language of good people and bad people, and being good and being, all that language is the way that we evaluate our life, we judge our lives, or God judges our lives. And in the end, you're judged on how much good you did in the world. Did you do more good or bad? What's the net? But don't get caught up in that, because the essence of you is neither. The essence of you is in the middle. Okay? Thoughts on that? Okay. Jen, one last, yeah, please.
Yeah, well, but is that saying then that the essence of you is what you think of you, or is the essence of you is how God is judging you?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Jen seemed to offer us such a sort of modern, kind of postmodern kind of spin on it. It's not, sorry to call you back, Jen. I'm just invoking you. But I think that I'm not sure that it's fair to say that there is an essence, right? That actually there is a shifting in us. The truth of the matter, it's like a tzaddik is a thought concept, a purely perfectly righteous or perfectly wicked person. Those are characters. We are people, and that's more complicated. I want to just end by saying that I have this copy of the Tanya that I got from my Aunt Bonnie Brindle. And I was reading in her house, and then I ended up traveling with it, and she said I could keep it. So it's my Aunt Bonnie's Tanya. My Aunt Brindle, Tante Brindle, she hates the word tzaddik. It's like one of the things that she's famous for. I'm like, ugh, I hate when anyone's called a tzaddik. And I think that Allison was talking about this too. It's dangerous when you start calling someone a righteous person. It's like, what is the point of that? Nobody's righteous. Nobody's righteous. Like, we're all people, right? And are these categories helpful or not? I think we can continue to debate that. But that suspicion, that's sort of where I'm glad that I have her Tanya, because like that spirit is hanging over the opening of this book and the name of this book, which is to say, like, aren't we all just trying to work it out here in the middle? So. All right, everyone. Great learning with you. Such a pleasure. 3 more weeks of this Ethics of the Mystics series, but you can always join us Mondays at noon for Mishna, Thursdays at noon for Parsha. All right. Good to see you all. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Great class as always.